the 20th century, the city reached a sort of critical mass. There were millions and millions of people all trying to live and work in the same place. And for centuries, we've made our offices and our houses and our factories bigger and bigger and closer together in an attempt to cram them all in. But even so, there would always come a point when you ran out of floor space, especially if you were in a place like this. Now, you can probably tell from the size of this light snack item that I'm in Manhattan, New York, an island. And because it's an island, it became the most intense urban experiment of the early 20th century. People came any way they could, and provided they were free of lice and anti-American views, they could stay somewhere. There was really only one option, which was to take the essentially medieval concept of the street and turn it on its end. It was time to go up. But that wasn't as easy as it sounds, because most buildings were still formed using bricks or stones, and that meant there was a limit to how high they could go. Not very, as it turns out. Yes, there was the Pyramid of Cheops, for 4,000 years the tallest building in the world. But it isn't exactly airy, and the master bedroom suite is barely big enough for one dead pharaoh and his trinkets. There's a fundamental problem to building with brick and stone. They're heavy, so the higher you go, the more of them you need at the bottom to hold the whole thing up. And very soon you arrive at a point where the base of your building is just a solid block. Like the pyramid, in fact. Clearly, achieving great height would require a new building technique. That building, the one disappearing into the Manhattan mist, holds the secret. It was pretty much the first skyscraper ever built, and it was paid for in cash by the founder of Woolworths. Completed in 1913, it is 240 metres of distinctly un-Woolworthsy Gothic grandeur. This is not like your local Woolworths. It's more like a cathedral than the nerve centre of a pick-and-mix empire. But there's Mr. Woolworth himself paying for it, in dimes and quarters, of course. And there's the architect, Cass Gilbert. It was a groundbreaking building. On opening night, the president himself switched on its 80,000 lights remotely from the White House. Roy?
Yes.
Roy, the building manager, has agreed to show me round. Does it involve going up very high?
Quite high.
47 floors up, the medieval extravagance gave way to something far more fascinating, something that hadn't been seen for almost a century. The top floors were being renovated, and with the brickwork and plaster removed, the secret of the skyscraper was laid bare. A tight matrix of steel girders bolted together like a giant Meccano set. This was a radical departure. It was also an inexact science.
Steel itself was not necessarily of uniform strength yet, because they sort of made it like you make soup from a recipe. They couldn't exactly control the strength, so they had a general range. So to compensate, they used a much larger safety factor and basically over-designed everything. The feeling being it was much better to over-design it than have a building sort of topple over in the wind because they had made a mistake.
Even so, it was the steel skeleton that allowed the Woolworths building to stand tall. So presumably the whole building would stand up just as its frame. You could just build the frame.
Yes.
It would stand up. The walls don't have any structural function. Are they just there to keep the wind out, in effect?
Right. The walls are only there to hold the windows in place and to keep the wind out. But if the walls themselves were not here, would not affect the building standing in any way, shape, or form. It would merely be cold and unpleasant.
The Woolworth Building was the first in a golden age of skyscrapers, all built with steel frames, all fantastically over-engineered. New York set the blueprint for a new kind of city, one driven partly by a shortage of space, but also by egos. The Chrysler Building broke the record in 1930 at 319 metres high, but its days at the #1 spot were short. 1 year later, the Empire State Building topped out at 443 metres. It held the record for 40 years. And not surprisingly, because cautious engineers, terrified by both gravity and the force of the wind, over-specified components, making these corporate monuments hideously expensive to build. To really make it big, the next generation of skyscrapers had to cost a lot less.